Mabrika, welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Taíno. I'm your host, Priscilla Colon, co-founder and creative here at Casareito, where our mission is to promote the Taíno language and culture. So today's episode, I want to recommend a lot of the books that I've been reading that will give you information not just about the culture, but also about the language of our Taíno ancestors. The first book on my list is available both in English and Spanish, and it's called Mitologia Religion de los Taínos, the mythology and religion of the Taínos. This book is by Sebastián Robiou Lamarche, and he is a historian who specializes in Caribbean history. In this book, he focuses on the creation stories as well as other myths or legends that were recorded by the Spanish chronicler Ramón Pané. And we'll be talking about Ramón Pané in just a little bit. Specifically, this book goes through the 4 cycles or time periods in the order in which we think the Taíno viewed the creation of the world, the creation of humans, and up to the point of encounter as well. These stories also present a lot of the cultural and mythical heroes of our Taíno ancestors. It includes illustrations and photos of artifacts, as well as a glossary of Taíno terms. One of the reasons I love this book is that it takes a lot of the stories that the chroniclers didn't understand and then compares them to other stories and oral traditions from other South American cousins. The author actually starts showing the comparisons of these stories and their true meaning. The most mind-blowing thing that I realized from reading this book, they weren't just a random story about a mythical person who fell out of a canoe and so on. It was actually pointing to specific position of the stars in the constellations. And why was this important? Because our Taíno ancestors were sailors, and the reason why these stories were told over and over again was to pass on the information of the location of certain stars in the constellations at certain seasons so that you could sail. Mind blown! I had no idea. And of course, the first chroniclers had no idea as well. It was only until I read it through this particular book that I understood that there was a lot more to these stories than just simple creation stories. So I hope that you will pick up this book and read it for yourself. It is very informational. The second book that I recommend is called Relación acerca de las antigüedades de los indios, an account of the antiquities of the Indians. This was the original writing of Ramón Pané, a friar who came on Columbus's second voyage. He was sent by Columbus to go live with the natives, the Indians or Indios, and gather their stories. The version of the stories that I'm referring to were by an editor called José Juan Arrom. Now, José Juan Arrom was a Yale professor who basically pioneered Hispanic studies in the United States. He was originally from Cuba, and he really understood history of the Caribbean, especially the native or indigenous peoples there. It was only when I read this version of Ramón Pané's stories that I understood how a lot of the misconceptions may have come about. It becomes very clear that he doesn't understand, and he writes it over and over again. I don't understand what they're trying to tell me. I'm not sure if this happened before or after something else. I'm really not understanding. So that's one thing. The other thing to note is Ramón Pané's initial document, it was lost. So the manuscript itself was kind of redone or recomposed by an Italian years later. The writer Italianized certain things, if somebody's name was Priscilla, for example, he would change it to Priscillaici to make it more Italian. It's really messed up. So the editor here, because he does a comparison with our sister languages, he's able to kind of say, ooh, this word was not correct. That's not what it means, and so on. One major misconception about the Taínos that has been passed on through generations is that Taínos could not count past 20. somehow they were just so primitive. They couldn't count more than 20 because they only had 10 fingers and 10 toes. Okay, when this editor went in and compared the language, he realized, no, they had a base 20 number system. So what is a base 20 number system? So we have a base 10 number system. It's a decimal system. It makes it easy to count by tens, right? So 10, 20, 30, 40. A base 20 number system makes it easy to count by 20. So you're actually multiplying much faster. You're adding much faster. You can see why somebody who didn't understand the language would be confused. So they used, for example, to say the number 5, to say it quickly, they would say one hand. Why? Because one hand has 5 fingers, right? To say the number 20, they would say one man. Why? Because one man had 10 fingers and 10 toes, 20. So if you said 2 men, you actually meant 40. 3 men, 60, and so on. So you're actually multiplying in your head. So all of these weird misconceptions that came from the original manuscript, this editor goes in and says, no, this is wrong. Look, linguistically, let's take a look at our Arawak and sister languages. This is what they say. And can I just say one thing? If the Taínos could only count to 20, how could they build canoes that fit 150 people? Doesn't make sense, right? So sometimes when you hear things that are just a little weird, stop and ask yourself the logical question. You're probably going to find out that, the Spaniards or whoever else wrote something really didn't understand what was going on. So the next book I want to recommend is called Taíno, a novel. And this follows the true story of Guaycan, also known in history as Diego or Dieguillo Colón. He was a 12-year-old Taíno who was actually kidnapped by Columbus and then, quote-unquote, adopted. That's why he has the last name Colón, which, as many of you know, is Columbus's Spanish last name. So he adopts this Taíno boy, and that boy serves as his official translator during his voyages with the Taínos. Now, this novel is interesting because it weaves in real information from the documents that have been saved throughout history, such as Columbus's diaries, Ramón Pané's book itself, and as well as Bartolomé de las Casas' writings, such as a short account of the destruction of the Indies. The best thing about this novel is that it's written from a Taíno's point of view. It's the perspective of the indigenous people, not of the quote-unquote conquerors, which is what you usually get when you research the Taínos' history. Also, this book covers a lot of the information of Cacique Guarocuya, also known as Enriquillo. He was a cacique on the island of Haiti/Quisqueya, and it was with him that the very first treaty in the Americas was established between a European power and an indigenous tribe. So the very first treaty was signed with Cacique Guarocuya, a Taíno cacique. The last book I want to recommend is a children's book that is called Once in Puerto Rico. And it's actually a collection of legends and other oral traditions from Boriquén, a lot of which are indigenous in nature. One of my favorite legends or stories is the legend of the hummingbird or colibri, and it talks about how the colibri came into being, but it doesn't just include legends of maybe mythical people. It also includes information or stories passed down about real people who lived on the island, one of which was Yuisa, and Yuisa was a cacique. So the city of Loíza, if you're familiar with Boriquén, was actually named after Cacique Yuisa, a female cacique of that area. And so you'll get to learn a little bit about her based on some of the oral traditions that were passed on. So those are my top 4 books to get you started learning about Taíno culture. And I hope that you enjoy them and that you get to know a little bit more about our ancestors, how they thought, how they viewed the world, and what their values were. If you have your own book recommendations, please write them down in the comments. I would love to hear from them. I actually read Taíno, a novel, because one of you recommended it to me. So thank you so much. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our children's books. They're a great way to introduce kids to Taíno words and phrases. As always, make sure that you subscribe and click the notifications. We have a lot of great community building activities for you, and I want to make sure you don't miss out on them. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and we can continue the conversation and exchange more ideas. Thank you again for subscribing. I am so happy that you're here with me learning Taíno, learning more about the culture of our Taíno ancestors. In the meantime, Tai Karaya Guaitiao Nagu.